The snow had stopped falling 3 hours ago, leaving behind a silence so complete that Maya could hear her own heartbeat stuttering in her chest. She pressed her back against the rough bark of the pine tree, her fingers numb inside her inadequate gloves, her breath coming in shallow gasps that crystallized in the frigid air. 4 days. It had been 4 days since the hiking group scattered when the storm hit. 4 days since she'd lost the trail. 4 days since her last real meal. The protein bar she'd found crushed at the bottom of her pack yesterday was nothing but a memory now, one that made her stomach clench with renewed desperation. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her vision swimming with dark spots that bloomed and faded like sinister flowers. She knew the signs of hypothermia, had read about them in her wilderness survival guide that now lay uselessly buried somewhere under 3 feet of snow, along with her tent and most of her supplies. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd been so prepared, so confident, so stupidly certain that she could handle a week-long trek through the Cascade Mountains. Now she was dying, slowly and painfully, and there wasn't a soul within miles who knew or cared. The thought should have terrified her, but she was too exhausted for terror. All she felt was a spreading numbness that went deeper than the cold, a resignation that whispered seductively about rest, about lying down in the snow and letting sleep take her away from the pain. She was considering it, actually weighing the option with what remained of her rational mind, when she heard the sound. At first, she thought it was her imagination, another cruel trick of her deteriorating senses. But then it came again, the deliberate crunch of boots on snow, steady and unhurried, moving through the forest with the confidence of something that belonged here. Maya's survival instinct flickered to life. She tried to call out, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper, her throat too dry and damaged to produce anything louder. She attempted to stand, pushing against the tree trunk, but her legs buckled immediately, sending her crumpling back into the snow. The footsteps stopped. Then, after a moment that stretched like eternity, they changed direction, coming toward her. He emerged from between the trees like something out of a legend, a figure so perfectly suited to this harsh landscape that he seemed carved from it. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of countless miles traveled through terrain that would break lesser men. His beard was thick and dark, touched with silver at the edges, his eyes the color of storm clouds, sharp and assessing as they swept over her huddled form. He wore a heavy canvas coat that had seen years of hard use, boots that were practically part of him, and he carried a rifle slung across his back with the casual ease of someone for whom it was simply another tool. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studied her with those penetrating eyes, and Maya felt a flush of shame cut through her cold-induced stupor. She knew what she must look like, a foolish city woman who'd bitten off more than she could chew, another tourist who'd underestimated the mountains and was now paying the price. But when he finally moved, there was no judgment in his actions, only a swift, practiced efficiency that spoke louder than words. He crouched before her, his movements controlled despite his size, and reached out with one gloved hand. His fingers, even through the leather, were warm when they touched her face, tilting her chin up so she had no choice but to meet his gaze. Up close she could see the weathered lines around his eyes, the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the unexpected kindness buried beneath the hardness. "You come with me," he said, and his voice was like gravel sliding down a mountain, rough and deep, and absolutely certain. It wasn't a question or a suggestion. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the kind of authority that came from a man who was accustomed to making life or death decisions and living with the consequences. Maya wanted to argue, wanted to assert some independence, some dignity, but her body had other ideas. The moment his hand left her face, she felt herself tipping sideways, the world tilting on its axis. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground, lifting her with shocking ease, and she had the distant thought that he must be incredibly strong to make her feel weightless. She tried to protest, managed something that might have been words, but he cut her off with a shake of his head. "Save your strength," he commanded, adjusting his grip so she was settled more securely against his chest. "It's a 3-mile walk to my cabin, and I need you conscious when we get there." Then he was moving, carrying her through the forest as if she weighed nothing at all, his strides long and steady and relentless. The journey to his cabin existed in Maya's memory as a series of fragmented impressions, moments of clarity punctuated by long stretches of gray fog. She remembered the rhythmic sway of his gait, the solid warmth of his chest against her cheek, the way his heartbeat was strong and steady beneath her ear. She remembered glimpses of the forest passing by, snow-laden branches creating a tunnel of white above them, the occasional call of a bird that sounded impossibly far away. She remembered trying to stay awake, fighting against the pull of unconsciousness, because some primal part of her brain insisted that falling asleep now would be the end. And she remembered his voice, low and continuous, talking to her about nothing and everything, the tracks they were passing, the elk herd that had moved through yesterday, the way the weather was finally breaking. He was keeping her anchored, she realized dimly, using his voice as a lifeline to pull her back each time she started to drift. When the cabin finally appeared through the trees, Maya's first thought was that it looked like something from a fairy tale, solid and squat and utterly real against the white landscape. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, promising heat, and the sight of it made her want to weep with relief. He carried her up 3 wooden steps and through a heavy door, and the blast of warm air that hit her face was so intense it was almost painful. The cabin's interior was a single large room, dominated by a stone fireplace where flames crackled and danced. She had impressions of rough-hewn furniture, shelves lined with supplies, animal pelts hanging from the walls, everything worn but meticulously maintained. He carried her to a chair near the fire and set her down gently, then immediately began stripping off her wet outer layers with brisk, impersonal efficiency. "Need to get you warm," he said, more to himself than to her. "Then food, then we'll see about the rest." Maya watched through half-closed eyes as he moved around the cabin with practiced purpose, adding wood to the fire, pulling blankets from somewhere, setting a kettle to boil. Every movement was deliberate, wasted nothing, revealed a man who had long ago learned to rely solely on himself. When he returned to her with a thick wool blanket and draped it around her shoulders, his hands lingered for just a moment on her arms. "You're going to be all right," he said, and there was something in his voice that made it sound like both a promise and a command. "I don't let people die on my mountain." The first thing Maya became fully aware of was the silence. Not the oppressive, threatening silence of the forest where she'd nearly died, but a different kind. Peaceful, safe, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and the whistle of wind around the cabin's eaves. She opened her eyes slowly, half expecting to find herself still slumped against that pine tree. The mountain man and the warm cabin, nothing but a hypothermia-induced hallucination. But the heat on her face was real. The weight of the blankets covering her was real, and when she turned her head, she saw him sitting at a rough wooden table across the room, cleaning his rifle with the same methodical care he seemed to apply to everything. He noticed her movement immediately, his head coming up, those storm cloud eyes fixing on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he set down the cloth he'd been using and stood, crossing to her in 3 long strides. "How do you feel?" His voice was still that deep rumble, but there was a carefulness to it now, as if he was afraid she might shatter. Maya considered the question. Her body ached in 1,000 places. Her fingers and toes burned with the pins and needles sensation of returning circulation, and her throat felt like she'd swallowed broken glass. But she was alive, warm, and safe. "Better," she managed, her voice a croak that made her wince. "Thank you. You saved my life." Something flickered across his face, too quick to identify. He moved to the fireplace and ladled something from a pot she hadn't noticed hanging there, the rich smell making her stomach clench with desperate hunger. "Soup," he said, bringing it to her. "Venison and root vegetables. Start slow or you'll make yourself sick." He was right, of course, and Maya forced herself to sip carefully, even though every instinct screamed at her to gulp it down. The broth was simple but perfect, warming her from the inside out, and she could feel strength flowing back into her limbs with each swallow. He watched her eat, standing a few feet away with his arms crossed, and she was acutely aware of how she must look, bruised, battered, pathetic. "I'm Maya," she said finally, needing to break the silence, to establish herself as a person rather than just another problem for him to solve. "Maya Chen. I was part of a hiking group, 10 of us, supposed to be doing the Pacific Crest Trail segment through this area. When the storm hit..." She trailed off, the memory still too raw, too frightening. "Marcus Wolf," he said after a moment, and she realized it was the first time he'd offered his name. "And you don't need to explain. I know what happened. Storm came in fast, hit harder than the weather service predicted. Your group scattered, made bad decisions in panic. I've been finding them for the past 2 days." Maya's head snapped up, soup forgotten. "The others? They're alive?" For the first time, she saw something that might have been sympathy cross his rugged features. "Most of them. Forest Service has been coordinating rescue efforts. Got 8 of them off the mountain already, various states of hypothermia and frostbite. But they'll recover. Been 1 more body found this morning, young man who tried to ford a creek that was running too high." The grief hit her like a physical blow. Tom. It had to be Tom, who'd been so excited about this trip, who'd talked endlessly about his photography and his dreams of capturing the perfect wilderness shot. "You were the last," Marcus continued, his voice gentler now. "Been searching this sector for 2 days. Was about to give up, head back, when I saw your tracks. Lucky I'm stubborn." Lucky. The word seemed inadequate for what had happened, for the impossible chance that had brought this man to her tree at the exact moment when she'd been ready to give up. Maya set down the soup, her hands trembling, and before she could stop them, tears were streaming down her face. She wasn't a crier, had always prided herself on her composure, but the past 4 days had stripped away every defense she'd built. She wept for Tom, for her own stupidity, for the terror she'd felt in those endless hours alone. Marcus didn't say anything, didn't offer empty platitudes or awkward comfort. Instead, he simply moved to sit on the edge of the chair, his presence solid and grounding, and waited while she cried herself out. When the sobs finally subsided into hiccups, she found a clean handkerchief pressed into her hand. "Storm's clearing," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "But there's another system moving in tomorrow night. Forest Service won't risk helicopters in unstable weather, which means you're here for at least another 36 hours. Maybe longer." The thought should have worried her, but instead, Maya felt only relief. The idea of facing the outside world right now, of answering questions and filling out reports and being pitied, was unbearable. Here, in this cabin with this taciturn man, she could just exist. Over the next hours, a strange routine established itself. Marcus moved through the cabin, tending to the fire, preparing meals, checking supplies, while Maya slowly regained her strength. He'd given her dry clothes, his own shirts and thermal pants that were comically oversized on her smaller frame, but they were warm and clean, and she'd never been more grateful for anything in her life. She watched him work, fascinated despite herself by the sheer competence he radiated. Everything he did was purposeful, nothing wasted, and she began to understand that this wasn't just a man who lived in the mountains. This was a man who had become part of them. "How long have you lived here?" she asked when the silence stretched too long, her curiosity finally overcoming her hesitation. He glanced up from the firewood he was stacking. "Going on 15 years now. Built this cabin myself. First 3 years I was here." 15 years. Maya tried to imagine it, tried to picture what would drive someone to leave civilization so completely behind. "Don't you get lonely?" The question was out before she could stop it. Too personal, too intrusive. But Marcus didn't seem offended. He straightened, considering, his gaze turning to the window where snow had begun to fall again in lazy spirals. "Lonely and alone aren't the same thing," he said finally. "The mountains teach you that. They teach you a lot of things if you're willing to listen." There was a story there, Maya sensed, layers of pain and choice and survival that ran deeper than anything she could imagine. She wanted to ask more, wanted to understand what had transformed this man into something halfway between human and myth, but something in his expression stopped her. Instead, she asked, "What do they teach you?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first she'd seen. "That you're smaller than you think. That nature doesn't care about your plans or your pride. That sometimes the only way forward is to let go of everything you thought you needed and learn to live with what actually matters." He turned back to his work, but Maya sat with his words, turning them over in her mind. She thought about her life before this trip, the corporate job she'd hated, the apartment she could barely afford, the relationship that had ended badly 3 months ago, the constant feeling that she was running on a treadmill going nowhere. She'd come on this hike to prove something, to herself and maybe to her ex who'd called her soft and sheltered. Instead, she'd nearly died and been saved by a man who seemed to have stepped out of time itself. As night fell and Marcus lit oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls, Maya realized something that should have frightened her, but didn't. She felt more real in this cabin, more present and alive, than she had in years of her normal life. And when Marcus brought her more soup and settled into the chair across from her, the silence between them wasn't awkward or empty. It was full of possibility. Maya woke on her second morning in the cabin to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, sensation so normal and yet so surreal in this context that for a moment she lay still, trying to orient herself. The window showed gray dawn light filtering through continuing snow, the second storm Marcus had predicted, right on schedule. She'd slept in the cabin's only bed, a sturdy frame built into the wall and piled with furs and blankets, while Marcus had taken the floor near the fire without complaint or discussion. The arrangement had felt strange but right, and she'd fallen into the deepest sleep she'd had in months, untroubled by the dreams that usually plagued her. She sat up carefully, her body still sore but noticeably better, and found Marcus at the stove, tending a cast-iron skillet with the same focused attention he gave everything. He'd shaved, she noticed with surprise, the thick beard trimmed back to reveal a strong jaw and a mouth that was firmer and more expressive than she'd expected. He looked younger without the full beard, maybe mid-40s instead of the timeless age she'd assigned him, and the change was striking. "Coffee's ready," he said without turning around, and Maya wondered if he had some sixth sense that told him when she was awake. "Radio weather says the storm will last through tonight, maybe into tomorrow morning. Forest Service is postponed until it clears." Another day, maybe two. Maya waited for the panic, the claustrophobia, the desperate need to get back to her real life. It didn't come. Instead, she felt a strange contentment settle over her like one of the warm blankets. She stood and moved to the table, accepting the cup of coffee Marcus poured from a battered enamel pot. It was strong and black, no sugar or cream offered, and it was exactly what she needed. They ate breakfast in companionable silence, and afterward, Maya insisted on helping with the dishes, despite Marcus's initial resistance. "I'm not an invalid anymore," she said firmly, meeting his eyes with a determination that surprised them both. "And I'm not going to sit around being useless while I'm here." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of respect maybe, or approval. "All right," he said. "Then you can help me check the traps, if you're up for a walk." The invitation startled her, but she found herself nodding before she'd fully thought it through. Marcus bundled her into layers of his own cold-weather gear, everything too large but functional, and they stepped out into the falling snow together. The forest in the storm was a different world, and Maya experienced it with new eyes now that she wasn't dying. Marcus moved through it with the confidence of someone reading a familiar book, pointing out tracks in the snow, explaining which animals made which marks, showing her how to read the forest's story. His trapline was extensive, humane devices set at careful intervals, and he checked each one with practiced efficiency. 2 had rabbits, which he harvested quickly and respectfully, murmuring what Maya realized was a prayer of thanks over each animal. "The mountains provide," he said when he caught her watching. "But you never take without acknowledgement, without gratitude. That's the first rule." They walked for over an hour, and Maya found herself opening up in a way she never did with strangers, maybe because Marcus didn't feel like a stranger anymore. She told him about her life, about the job that had ground her down, about the relationship that had ended when she'd finally admitted she wanted different things than her partner, about the constant feeling that she was living someone else's idea of success instead of her own. Marcus listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that cut straight to the heart of things with uncomfortable precision. "Why did you stay so long?" he asked about her job. "In something that made you miserable." Maya considered, her breath pluming in the cold air. Fear, I guess. Fear of failing. Fear of disappointing people. Fear of admitting I'd made the wrong choices. It's easier to just keep going, you know, to tell yourself it'll get better. "No," Marcus said simply. "It's not easier. It's just more familiar. There's a difference." They were walking back toward the cabin when Maya finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind since she'd arrived. "What brought you up here, Marcus? 15 years ago. What made you leave?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, as the cabin came into view through the trees, he spoke. "I was a different person then. Lived in Seattle, had a wife I loved, a daughter who was everything to me. Worked as a corporate lawyer, made good money, had the big house and the fancy car and all the things you're supposed to want." Past tense. Maya's heart clenched at the implications. There was an accident, Marcus continued, his voice flat now, carefully controlled. Drunk driver ran a red light. Emma, my daughter, died instantly. My wife Sarah held on for 2 days before her injuries were too much. I was at the office when it happened, working late on a case I can't even remember now, something that seemed important at the time. The raw pain in his words made Maya's chest tight. She wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but everything that came to mind felt inadequate. I tried to go back to normal, Marcus said as they climbed the cabin steps. Went to therapy, took time off, did everything you're supposed to do, but I couldn't do it. Couldn't sit in meetings and pretend quarterly earnings mattered. Couldn't make small talk about sports and weather. Couldn't exist in a world that just kept spinning like nothing had happened, so I walked away from all of it, sold the house, liquidated everything, and came here. Built this cabin with my own hands because I needed to make something that would last, that would mean something, and I've been here ever since. Inside the cabin, he finally turned to face her, and the vulnerability in his eyes took her breath away. The mountains don't lie to you, Maya. They don't pretend to be something they're not. They're harsh and beautiful and indifferent, and they'll kill you if you're not paying attention. But they're honest. After everything, I needed honest. Maya understood then, really understood what she was looking at. Not a hermit or a recluse, but a man who had been broken so completely that he'd had to rebuild himself from scratch, and had chosen to do it in the only place that made sense to him. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand. His fingers were calloused and strong, and they closed around hers with surprising gentleness. "I'm sorry," she said, "for your loss, for your pain. I can't imagine." "No," he agreed. "You can't, and I hope you never can." They stood like that for a long moment, hands clasped, two damaged souls finding unexpected connection in the most unlikely place. Then Marcus squeezed her fingers once and released her, turning to tend the fire with his usual efficiency. But something had shifted between them. Some barrier had dissolved, and when they sat down to prepare the rabbits for dinner, working side by side in comfortable synchronicity, Maya felt a peace she hadn't known she was missing. That evening, as snow continued to fall and the fire crackled and Marcus taught her how to clean and cook game properly, Maya made a decision. She didn't know what would happen when the storm cleared and the Forest Service came to collect her. Didn't know if she'd return to her old life or strike out in some new direction. But she knew that this time in the cabin, these days with this remarkable man, had shown her something essential about herself. She'd come to the mountains looking for a challenge, for proof of her own strength. Instead, she'd found something more valuable, the understanding that strength wasn't about conquering nature or proving anything to anyone else. It was about knowing yourself deeply enough to choose the life you actually wanted, not the one you thought you should want. As if reading her thoughts, Marcus looked up from the pot he was stirring and said, "The mountains choose who they keep and who they send back. You'll know, when the time comes, which one you are." And looking into his eyes across the firelight, Maya thought maybe, just maybe, she already did.